If you've ever wondered how well you really know the person you've loved for decades, this story is for you. And if this story keeps you guessing until the end, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you would have done. After 28 years of marriage, my husband asked for a divorce, then my daughter revealed the truth. The smell of rosemary chicken still lingered in the kitchen as I carried 2 mugs of coffee into the living room. Steam curled off the surface and disappeared into the soft yellow light of the lamp by the window. The same lamp Richard had bought me for our 10th anniversary because I'd complained the overhead light was too harsh for reading. 28 years, and I still remembered which bulbs he'd replaced and which ones I had. It was a Thursday evening in late September, and after 28 years of marriage, Thursdays had become wonderfully predictable. Richard always watched the evening news from his favorite leather chair, the one with the worn armrest where his elbow had rested 1,000 times. I curled up on the opposite end of the couch with a mystery novel I rarely managed to finish before falling asleep, the same paperback dog-eared at chapter 6 for nearly a month now. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was ours. Our children were grown. Emma was 31 and lived about 40 minutes away with her husband and little daughter Lily. Daniel, 27, had recently started his first management job in Chicago, calling every Sunday evening like clockwork to tell us about his new apartment and his new life. The house that once echoed with homework arguments, birthday parties, and late-night movie marathons had become almost too quiet. Some nights I would stand in the hallway and listen to nothing at all, and I would ache for the noise we used to complain about. Richard and I often joked that we'd finally reached the easy part of life. The mortgage was nearly paid off, the children were happy, we had grandchildren to spoil and vacations to plan, and nowhere left to prove ourselves. Or at least I thought we had reached that part. That evening, he barely touched his dinner. I had made his favorite, rosemary chicken with roasted potatoes, the recipe I'd perfected over a decade of small adjustments, and he pushed it around his plate like a teenager sulking through a meal he didn't ask for. I noticed, but I told myself it was nothing. Men got quiet sometimes. Husbands got tired. 30 years of marriage teaches you which silences to leave alone. He answered my questions with distracted nods. When I asked whether he wanted to watch the new documentary I'd added to our list, he said, "Sure, whatever you want," in a voice that told me he hadn't heard the question at all. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the hallway where his briefcase rested against the wall, as though it were watching him, as though it held something he couldn't stop thinking about. I assumed work was weighing on him again. Richard had spent more than 30 years climbing the corporate ladder, starting as a junior analyst and working his way up until his name appeared on the door of a corner office. Deadlines, board meetings, late-night conference calls, those things came with the territory, and I had learned long ago not to take his silence personally. I had learned to give him room to breathe after a hard day, the way he gave me room after mine. "Everything okay?" I asked, as I handed him his coffee, my fingers brushing his for just a moment. He looked up and forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Tired," he said. "Long day?" "The longest." I reached over and squeezed his hand, the same hand that had slipped a ring onto my finger under a string of lights at our wedding reception, the same hand that had held mine through 2 childbirths and one terrifying night in a hospital waiting room when Emma needed emergency surgery as a little girl. "We've survived longer ones," I said, trying to coax a real smile out of him. For a brief second, his fingers tightened around mine, so tightly it almost hurt. Then he quietly pulled his hand away, setting his coffee down with more care than the moment required, as if he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't holding mine. Something about that tiny movement unsettled me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so unlike him. In 28 years, Richard Carter had never once pulled away from my touch. If anything, he was the one who reached for my hand in grocery store lines and church pews and quiet moments in front of the television. That small retreat felt like a crack in a foundation I had never once doubted. Later that evening, I wandered into the laundry room while Richard remained in the kitchen, telling myself I needed to fold towels, when really I needed a moment to breathe. As I worked, I caught myself smiling, despite the strange unease still sitting in my chest. Next month would mark our 29th wedding anniversary. I'd already started planning a surprise weekend getaway to the small coastal town where we'd spent our honeymoon, the one with the gray-shingled inn and the pier where Richard had promised, half joking and half serious, that we would grow old together and still walk that same stretch of sand. I could almost picture us walking the beach again, older now, slower perhaps, but still together. I had already called the inn. I had already found the same room, if it was available, the one with the window facing the water. I hadn't told him yet. I wanted it to be a surprise, something to remind us both that after all these years, there was still magic left in an ordinary marriage. Life hadn't been perfect. We'd argued over money in the early years, back when his salary barely covered the mortgage, and my part-time job barely covered anything at all. We'd worried about our children through fevers and failed classes, and one terrifying month when Daniel wouldn't talk to either of us. We'd buried Richard's parents within 18 months of each other, and I remembered holding him together with nothing but my arms and my patience, while he grieved in the quiet, controlled way men of his generation had been taught to grieve. We'd celebrated promotions, graduations, and the birth of our granddaughter, Lily, whose first cry had made Richard weep in the hospital hallway, in a way I had never seen before or since. Through every high and every low, we'd chosen each other, or so I believed. When I returned to the kitchen, Richard was standing by the window. The lights were off. He was staring into the darkness outside, as though searching for an answer only the night could give him, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of a street lamp 2 houses down. "Rich?" I said softly. He didn't turn around immediately. When he finally faced me, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. Fear, not stress and not exhaustion, but the raw, unguarded kind that men like Richard rarely let show, the kind you only see in someone who has run out of ways to protect the people he loves. My stomach tightened. "Richard, what's wrong?" He took a slow breath, the kind you take before diving into cold water. "Evelyn, sit down." There was something in his voice that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I obeyed without another word, lowering myself into the chair across from him at our dining table, the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 family dinners, where our children had done homework and drawn crayon pictures we still had folded away in a box in the attic. He walked to the dining table and, from inside his briefcase, removed a large manila envelope, carefully, deliberately, like a man handling something that might explode. Then he placed it between us, the space between 2 coffee mugs suddenly feeling like the widest gap I had ever seen. "I've been trying to find another way," he whispered. "I couldn't." I frowned, my heart already racing, though I didn't yet understand why. "What are you talking about?" His eyes filled with tears. Richard Carter wasn't a man who cried. In nearly 3 decades of marriage, I'd seen him cry only twice. Once when his father died, standing at the graveside with his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack, and once when Emma was rushed into surgery as a little girl, his whole body shaking in the waiting room chair beside mine. Seeing tears in his eyes now, over what appeared to be an ordinary Thursday evening, made my pulse race in a way I couldn't explain. "Evelyn," he swallowed hard, "I want a divorce." For a heartbeat, I simply stared at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. Because the man sitting across from me had spent the morning fixing the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom and had texted me at lunch to ask if I wanted him to pick up flowers on his way home. Men planning to leave their wives did not fix faucets. They did not ask about flowers. "That's not funny," I said. "I'm not joking." The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. I searched his face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some flicker that would tell me he'd misspoken, that the words had come out wrong. There wasn't one. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside were neatly prepared divorce papers, already signed. His signature sat at the bottom of the page in the same steady hand that had signed our marriage license 28 years earlier, and the sight of it made my vision blur with tears I hadn't given myself permission to shed yet. 28 years. Reduced to a stack of legal documents typed in cold, impersonal font. I looked up, barely able to speak. "Why?" He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry." "No." My voice cracked, splitting down the middle the way old wood splits under pressure. "Don't tell me you're sorry. Tell me why." He remained silent. "Is there someone else?" The question tasted like poison leaving my mouth, but I needed to ask it. I needed to give this nightmare a shape I could understand. even an ugly one. His jaw tightened. No. Then what happened? Nothing. Not a single explanation. Not a single accusation. Not a single fight. Only silence, stretching out between us like the surface of a frozen lake, thin and dangerous, and threatening to crack beneath the smallest weight. Finally, he looked directly into my eyes and said 5 words that would echo in my mind for weeks. "You'll be safer without me." I stared at him, unable to understand what he meant. Safer? Safer from what? From him? The idea was absurd. Richard had never so much as raised his voice at me in anger, let alone his hand. He was the gentlest man I had ever known, the kind who apologized to furniture when he bumped into it, the kind who cried during commercials about rescue dogs. Before I could ask another question, the front doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was our daughter, Emma, her arms wrapped around a foil-covered casserole dish, completely unaware that the ground beneath our family had just begun to shift. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house like a gunshot. Neither Richard nor I moved. For a long second, we simply stared at each other across the dining table, the divorce papers lying between us like a wall that had suddenly divided our lives into 2 separate worlds, the one we had built together for 28 years, and the one he seemed determined to enter alone. The bell rang again. This time, more urgently. I wiped away the tears gathering in my eyes and forced myself to stand, smoothing my blouse, as though a wrinkle in the fabric could somehow hide the wreckage sitting on the table behind me. "I'll get it," I said, my voice thinner than I intended. Richard didn't answer. He remained seated, elbows resting on the table, his face buried in his trembling hands. It was the first time in nearly 3 decades that I had looked at my husband and realized I no longer knew the man sitting before me. The Richard I married didn't hide. The Richard I married talked things through, even the hard things, even when it cost him. As I opened the front door, I found my daughter standing on the porch with a warm smile and a foil-covered casserole dish balanced carefully in her hands. Behind her, a car idled at the curb, and I recognized her husband's silhouette in the driver's seat, waiting to pull away once she was safely inside. "Mom," Emma beamed. "Surprise! I made too much lasagna and figured you and Dad could use a Thursday night off from cooking." Behind her, little Lily bounced excitedly on the front steps, her sneakers lighting up with every hop. "Grandma!" She threw herself into my arms before I could even speak, and I caught her, holding her small body against mine, as though she were the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly gone soft and uncertain beneath my feet. "I missed you," she whispered into my shoulder. "I missed you too, sweetheart." My voice wavered, and I prayed she was too young to notice. Emma studied my face for a moment, the way she had studied it since she was small, the way she always seemed to know when something was wrong before I said a word. "Mom!" Her smile faded. "Have you been crying?" I quickly turned away, busying myself with holding the door. "Oh, it's nothing. You've never been able to lie to me." I forced a weak laugh, one that came out more like a breath. "Come inside." As Emma stepped into the hallway, casserole dish still balanced in her arms, she immediately sensed the tension hanging in the air. The house felt unusually quiet. No television, no music, no conversation. Only silence, thick enough to touch. She looked toward the dining room and spotted Richard sitting motionless at the table, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look older than his 60 years. "Dad?" He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone couldn't fix. Emma frowned, setting the casserole dish down on the counter without looking away from her father. "What happened?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came, only the small, helpless movement of a man trying to find courage he didn't have. Emma turned back to me. "Mom, what's going on?" I looked down at the envelope still lying on the table, the manila paper suddenly seeming to glow with everything it contained. Without saying a word, I pushed it gently toward her. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the signature. For several seconds she didn't move, her whole body gone still the way it used to when she was small, and had broken something she didn't know how to confess. Finally, she looked up. "Divorce?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. She looked at her father in complete disbelief. "Dad?" He couldn't meet her eyes, and his silence answered the question louder than words could have. What is this? Emma's breathing grew heavier, her chest rising and falling in short, angry bursts. You and Mom don't even fight, she said, waiting for an answer that never came. You've been married almost 30 years, she pressed, met again with nothing. So explain it. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the hardwood floor, the sound sharp enough to make Lily look up from the living room where she had wandered off, drawn by the television. I'm sorry, he said again, as though the words could somehow fill the enormous gap he had opened between us. No. Emma shook her head, stepping closer. Close enough that I could see the shine of tears gathering in her own eyes now. I'm not accepting I'm sorry. She held up the papers, her hand shaking. What happened? Richard stared at the family photographs lining the hallway wall, as though they might offer him an escape route. There we were at Disney World, sunburned and grinning beneath Cinderella's castle. Emma's high school graduation, her cap thrown mid-air. Daniel's college graduation, Richard's arm slung proudly around his son's shoulders. Our silver wedding anniversary, the two of us laughing at some joke I could no longer remember the punchline to. 28 years of memories frozen in smiling photographs, all of them suddenly feeling like evidence in a trial none of us had agreed to attend. I can't explain, he said. Emma's frustration boiled over. You can't? He closed his eyes. No. Or you won't. For a brief second, something flashed across Richard's face. Fear. Real fear. Not guilt and not embarrassment, but the same look I had seen only moments earlier. The look that had made my stomach drop when he first sat me down at the table. Emma noticed it too. She softened her voice, the anger in it giving way to something more frightened, more careful. Dad. A pause. Are you in some kind of trouble? Richard looked at her for what felt like forever, his eyes moving between his wife and his daughter, as though weighing which of us he could bear to disappoint less. Then he quietly said, The less you know, the safer you'll be. The words sent a chill through the room. Emma exchanged a puzzled glance with me. Safer? Again. The exact same word he had used with me not 20 minutes earlier. Before either of us could ask another question, Richard picked up his coat from the back of the chair. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. What? The word tore out of me before I could stop it. You can't just leave, I said, my voice breaking on the last word. He hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the doorknob, as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. Without turning around, he spoke one last sentence. I never stopped loving you. Then he walked out into the cold September night. The front door closed with a quiet click, yet somehow it sounded louder than thunder, louder than anything I had heard in 28 years of marriage, a sound that seemed to rearrange the furniture of my entire life in a single instant. For several moments, no one spoke. Little Lily, too young to understand, wandered into the kitchen and asked if there was ice cream, humming happily to herself, as though the world outside her small universe hadn't just cracked in half. Emma remained frozen, staring at the door, as though Richard might walk back through it and explain everything with a laugh, tell us it was all some elaborate misunderstanding. He didn't. Finally, she whispered, Mom. I looked at her, unable to speak. I don't think Dad left because he fell out of love. Neither did I. Because if a man wanted to leave his wife for another woman, he didn't usually cry harder than the woman he was leaving. He didn't usually beg forgiveness for a decision that supposedly freed him. He didn't usually look like a man, walking toward a firing squad instead of toward freedom. Emma slowly folded the divorce papers and placed them back inside the envelope, her movements deliberate, almost protective, as though the papers themselves were something fragile that needed careful handling. Then she looked toward the dark window where her father's car had disappeared into the night. I think Dad is hiding something. I wanted to believe she was wrong. I wanted more than anything to believe that this was simply a marriage, quietly dying of its own exhaustion, the way marriages sometimes do after decades of routine. That would have been easier. That would have been a grief I understood. But deep down, for the first time that night, I realized she might be right, and that frightened me more than the divorce papers ever could. The house had never felt so quiet. After Emma tucked Lily into the guest bedroom, promising her a pancake breakfast in the morning, she returned to the kitchen where I sat staring at 2 untouched coffee mugs. The steam had disappeared long ago, leaving behind only the cold, bitter smell of coffee no one wanted anymore. Neither of us wanted to be the first to speak. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and fell silent. It was the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel enormous. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "Mom, has Dad been acting differently these past few months?" I thought about it, turning the past few months over in my mind, the way you turn over a stone, looking for something hidden beneath it. Richard had become more distracted. He worked later than usual, sometimes not coming home until well past dinner, with no explanation beyond a tired shrug. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night and walk downstairs, and I would hear the creak of the stairs and assume it was indigestion or a restless mind. More than once I'd found him sitting alone on the back porch before sunrise, staring into the darkness, with a cup of black coffee in his hands, his face lit only by the porch light, looking like a man keeping vigil over something only he could see. I thought it was work, I admitted, the words tasting like an excuse, even as I said them. Emma nodded slowly. I noticed something too. What? 3 weeks ago, I stopped by his office to surprise him with lunch. I hadn't seen him in a while, and I thought it would be nice, just the two of us, like when I was in college and used to bring him sandwiches. And? He wasn't there. I frowned. Maybe he was in a meeting. That's what his assistant said. Emma hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. But when I asked where the meeting was, she looked nervous, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. A chill ran through me. She told me Dad had left unexpectedly. Did she say where he went? Emma shook her head. No. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, even though we were alone in the house. It felt like she was hiding something. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my eyes drifted toward Richard's home office, the door standing slightly open at the end of the hallway, a rectangle of darkness that suddenly seemed to hold more weight than it had an hour ago. "I've never gone through his things," I whispered, almost ashamed to admit it, as though respecting his privacy for 28 years had somehow been a mistake. Emma looked at me. Neither have I. But tonight, she understood before I finished. We weren't trying to invade his privacy. We were trying to understand why the man we loved had walked away without explaining why, and some understanding felt worth the guilt of crossing a line neither of us had ever crossed before. Richard's office looked exactly as he'd left it. His desk was perfectly organized, the way it always was, pens aligned in a neat row, folders stacked neatly by height, his reading glasses resting beside an open notebook filled with his small, careful handwriting. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary, as though someone had staged the room to look untouched. Emma carefully opened the top drawer. Nothing, just office supplies, paper clips, a stapler, a half-used roll of stamps. The second drawer held family photographs, old birthday cards Emma and Daniel had made as children, a faded Father's Day drawing Daniel had colored in elementary school, a crayon rendering of a stick figure family standing in front of a lopsided house. My chest ached looking at it. The third drawer wouldn't open. "It's locked," Emma said, tugging at the small brass handle. I blinked. Locked? In 28 years of marriage, Richard had never locked a drawer in our home. He didn't believe in locks between people who trusted each other. He used to joke that the only things worth locking away were things you were ashamed of, and Richard Carter, as far as I had ever known, had nothing to be ashamed of. Emma gently tugged the handle again. Nothing. She looked at me. Did Dad ever keep a key? I searched my memory, sifting through decades of small domestic details, the kind of things a wife knows without ever consciously learning them. Then something clicked into place. The grandfather clock. Richard always kept a small brass key inside the hidden compartment at the bottom, tucked behind a loose panel he'd shown me once, years ago, in case anything ever happened to the clock's delicate mechanism. I had forgotten about it entirely until that moment. We hurried into the living room. Sure enough, the key was still there, cool and slightly tarnished, exactly where it had rested for who knew how many years. Emma returned to the office. My heart pounded as she slid it into the lock, and with a soft click, the drawer swung open. Inside, there wasn't cash. There weren't photographs of another woman. There wasn't the kind of evidence that would have made this whole nightmare simple, ordinary, explainable, in the way affairs are explainable. Instead, there was a thick brown file. On the cover, in Richard's neat handwriting, were 4 words. If anything happens. Emma looked at me. Neither of us breathed. Slowly, she opened the file. The first page contained bank statements from an account I had never heard of. The numbers on it, larger than anything Richard and I had ever discussed together. The second page listed several company names I had never heard of, unfamiliar letterhead and logos I didn't recognize. The third page was a handwritten letter. Emma unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling now as much as mine. It began, "Evelyn, if you're reading this, then events unfolded exactly as I feared." My hands started trembling. Emma looked up. "Mom?" I could barely speak. "Keep reading." She swallowed hard and continued. "I wish I could tell you everything face to face. I wanted to. More than once I almost did. But every time I tried, I remembered the threats. The word landed like a stone between us." Emma's eyes widened, and she kept reading. "None of this began with our family. It began 12 years ago, with a business decision I believed was harmless." "What business decision?" Emma whispered, as much to herself as to me. The next page was missing, torn out, completely gone, only a jagged edge remaining where it had once been bound into the file. We searched the folder again. Nothing. The letter jumped straight to the final page. "Trust no one until you know the whole truth." At the bottom, Richard had signed his name, the same signature I had seen on the divorce papers not 2 hours earlier, except this one felt different. This one felt like a man trying to protect us instead of abandon us. Emma lowered the papers. Neither of us knew what to think. This wasn't the confession of a man leaving his wife for another woman. It sounded like the warning of someone trying to protect his family from something far larger than an unhappy marriage. Then Emma noticed something tucked into the back of the folder. A small white envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Richard, younger, perhaps 10 or 12 years younger, standing beside a smiling man in front of an office building neither of us recognized. Across the man's face, someone had drawn a thick black X with a marker, the ink dark and deliberate. On the back of the photo were 5 handwritten words. "He destroyed more than lives." Emma slowly turned the picture over again, studying the stranger's face, as though it might offer answers if she looked long enough. I've never seen him before. Neither had I. But somehow, I knew this stranger held the answers we'd been searching for. And somewhere out there, Richard was facing him alone. Neither of us slept that night, though we both pretended to for Lily's sake. By the time the sun rose, gray and unwilling over the neighborhood, the kitchen table had already become something else entirely. Not a place for breakfast, but a place for evidence. The photograph sat in the center, the black X staring back at us like an accusation. The torn letter lay beside it. The bank statements were spread out in a fan, their unfamiliar account numbers seeming to multiply the longer we looked at them. "We need to find out who he is," Emma said, opening her laptop with the kind of grim determination I hadn't seen in her since she'd studied for her bar exam years earlier, before deciding law wasn't the life she wanted. We started simply enough, searching Richard's name alongside the words business partner, investment, financial scandal, phrases that felt almost absurd, typed into a search bar next to the name of the man who still, somewhere in this town, kept his shoes lined up by size in our closet. Most of what came back was harmless. Richard's name appeared in old company newsletters, photographs from charity galas, a mention in the local paper when he'd been promoted to vice president 15 years earlier, his tie a little too wide for the era, his smile easy and unburdened. Then Emma zoomed in on the photograph itself, the black X, the stranger's half-visible name badge clipped to his jacket. Only a fragment of a word was legible. Lane. She typed it alongside the name of one of the unfamiliar companies from the bank statements. Several unrelated results appeared. A lane in a housing development 3 states away, a hardware store called Lane's, nothing useful. Then one article caught her attention, nearly 12 years old, buried on the 3rd page of results. The headline read, "Local Executive Resigns After Investment Firm Collapse." Emma clicked it, and the screen filled with a grainy photograph taken outside a courthouse. A group of men in dark suits descending the steps with their heads down against a bank of cameras. There, in the middle of the group, stood the same man from Richard's photograph. His full name appeared beneath the image. Michael Lane. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. I've never heard your father mention him. Emma continued reading aloud, her voice growing tighter with every sentence. Michael Lane had co-founded a private investment company with several partners. The article named 2 others, but the print was too small and blurred to make out clearly. The business had promised to help ordinary families invest safely. Small nest eggs and retirement savings pooled together and managed responsibly. Instead, the company had collapsed after millions of dollars disappeared, the money simply gone, no trace of where it had gone or who had taken it. Although no criminal charges were ultimately filed against Lane himself, lawsuits followed for years, families losing homes and retirements they could never recover. The article ended by saying Michael Lane had disappeared from public life shortly afterward, resigning quietly and never granting another interview. Emma frowned. Disappeared? My stomach tightened, a slow, cold feeling spreading through my chest. Richard never told me he had business partners like this. He told me he worked for the firm downtown, the same firm the whole time. He never mentioned starting anything of his own. We spent the better part of that morning piecing together fragments, old newspaper archives, a defunct company website preserved only in an internet archive, a handful of court records Emma managed to find through a legal database she still had access to from her old job. Slowly, painfully, a picture began to emerge. 12 years earlier, Richard had quietly invested in a venture with Michael Lane and 2 other partners, an investment firm meant to help working families build modest retirement savings. It had started small, almost like a passion project, something Richard believed in deeply, and then, according to the fragmented records, something had gone terribly wrong. Money had vanished, clients had been left with nothing, lawsuits had piled up. And somewhere in the wreckage, Richard's name appeared only briefly, in a single deposition transcript Emma found, in which he stated under oath that he had discovered irregularities and attempted to report them internally. He tried to stop it, Emma whispered, staring at the transcript excerpt on her screen. Whatever this was, Dad tried to stop it. I sat back in my chair, feeling as though the ground beneath our home had shifted once again. Then why didn't he ever tell us? Why let us believe nothing happened? Why let this haunt him alone for 12 years? Emma didn't have an answer. Neither did I. It was in the quiet after that discovery, both of us staring at the screen without speaking, that I began to understand something about my husband I hadn't allowed myself to see before. For 12 years, Richard had carried something heavy enough to break most men, and he had carried it silently, protecting us from a burden he believed was his alone to bear. He had gone to work every day, coached Daniel's little league team, walked Emma down the aisle, celebrated every ordinary joy of our life together, all while some dark secret sat coiled beneath the surface of everything, waiting. I didn't yet understand the shape of what he had been protecting us from, but I understood, for the first time since he'd placed those divorce papers on our table, that this wasn't a man abandoning his family. This was a man who believed abandoning us was the only way left to save us. It was Emma who noticed it first, a strange sound from outside, a car engine idling too long across the street for it to be anything ordinary. She rose from the table and moved to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to look out. A dark sedan sat parked along the curb, 2 houses down, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. It hadn't been there when we woke that morning. "Mom," she said quietly, without turning around, "there's someone out there." We watched for nearly 10 minutes, neither of us daring to move closer to the window, both of us feeling suddenly absurdly exposed inside our own home. The car didn't move. No one got out. It simply sat there, engine humming low, as though waiting for something. Then, just as Emma reached for her phone to call the police, the car pulled slowly away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. We told ourselves it was nothing, a neighbor's guest. A delivery driver checking an address. But neither of us believed it. Not really. Not after everything we'd found spread across the kitchen table. It was nearly an hour later, after Lily had woken and been fed and settled in front of a cartoon in the living room, that Emma found the envelope. It had been slipped beneath the front door some time while we weren't looking. No postmark, no name, nothing but a single folded sheet of paper inside. She unfolded it with shaking hands. There was only one sentence, typed in plain block letters. "Stop looking, or you'll lose him forever." Emma looked up at me, her face pale as the paper itself. "Mom." I took the note from her hands, reading it twice, 3 times, as though repetition might change its meaning. It didn't. Whatever Richard had been running from for 12 years had just found its way to our front door. Emma barely slept that second night either. Every time she closed her eyes, she told me later, she saw the photograph with the black X across the stranger's face, and beneath it, in her mind, the block letters of the note that had been slipped beneath our door. By sunrise, the kitchen table had become something closer to an investigation board than a place we ate breakfast. The photograph, the torn letter, the bank statements, a yellow legal pad covered in Emma's handwriting, filled with tangled rope. I stood by the window with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the first rays of sunlight spill across the quiet, ordinary neighborhood where we had raised our children and buried Richard's parents and lived a life I had believed, until 2 nights ago, was simple. Normally, Richard would already be outside watering the flowers. He insisted roses deserved attention before the heat of the day, a small, gentle ritual he'd kept up every summer for as long as I could remember. Now the garden stood untouched, the roses beginning to droop from neglect, just like everything else in our lives. "I still don't understand," I whispered, more to myself than to Emma. "If your father was trying to protect us, why leave? Why not just tell us the truth and let us face it together?" Emma looked up from the papers spread before her, dark circles beneath her eyes. Maybe leaving was the only way he thought he could protect us. Maybe he thought if he wasn't here, whatever this is couldn't touch us. Before I could answer, Emma's phone buzzed against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. The screen displayed one word: Dad. Her heart leaped. I could see it in the way her whole body straightened. She answered immediately, pressing the phone to her ear so hard her knuckles went white. "Dad." Only silence answered on the other end. "Can you hear me?" For a few seconds, nothing. Then, heavy breathing, as though Richard was running, his breath coming in ragged, uneven bursts. Finally, his voice came through, soft, urgent, nothing like the calm, measured tone I had known for 28 years. "Emma, don't come looking for me." She stood so quickly her chair fell backward, clattering against the tile floor. "Where are you? I don't have much time." "Dad, please tell me what's happening." Her voice cracked on the last word, and I felt my own chest tighten in response. "You and your mother need to leave the house." Emma froze. "What?" "Today." Her pulse quickened. I could see it in the way her free hand pressed flat against her chest. "Why?" Richard lowered his voice, and I strained to hear it even from across the room. "They know you found the file." Emma's eyes widened. She looked toward me, and I had already guessed something was terribly wrong from the way her face had drained of color. "Dad," she said, "who knows?" A loud crash echoed through the phone, sudden and violent, followed by shouting. A voice Emma didn't recognize, muffled and distant, but unmistakably angry. Richard spoke again, almost whispering now, his words tumbling faster than before. "Whatever happens, I love you both." The line went dead. "Dad?" Nothing answered but static. "Dad." And then the call simply ended. Emma called back immediately. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail, again. Then nothing at all. She slowly lowered the phone, her face gone pale as paper. I rushed over, my own heart hammering against my ribs. "What happened?" Emma swallowed hard. "He knows we opened the drawer." The room fell silent, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Just then, a loud knock echoed through the front door. 3 slow knocks. Not the cheerful knock of a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Not the impatient knock of a delivery driver running behind schedule. 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart, the kind that felt calculated rather than casual. Emma and I exchanged nervous glances. Neither of us moved. The knocking came again. Emma carefully approached the front window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see outside. No one. The porch was empty, the morning light falling across an ordinary welcome mat and an ordinary flower pot, everything looking exactly as it should. She opened the door cautiously, her body angled as though ready to slam it shut again at the first sign of danger. Nothing. only a small brown package resting neatly on the welcome mat. No postage, no return address, no name. She carried it inside, and we set it on the kitchen table beside the rest of our makeshift evidence. Inside was an old flip phone, scratched along its edges as though it had been used years earlier and stored away in a drawer somewhere. A charger, coiled neatly beside it, and a folded note, in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. Do not call my regular number again. Charge this phone. Wait for it to ring. Trust no one until then. I looked up in disbelief. This can't be real. Emma turned the phone over in her hands, studying its scratches, its age, wondering how long Richard had kept this device hidden away, waiting for a day exactly like this one. She plugged it into the charger. The screen flickered weakly, then steadied. A battery icon appeared. Then, a single unread text message, received months earlier but never opened. The sender's name wasn't saved, only a string of unfamiliar digits. The message contained only 6 chilling words. Your family will pay next. Emma stared at the screen, unable to breathe. Someone had been threatening Richard long before he asked for the divorce, long before the manila envelope had appeared on our dining table, long before any of this had reached our front door. She looked toward me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something new settle over her face. Not just fear, but resolve. The same stubborn determination she'd had as a child when she refused to give up on a puzzle until every piece was in place. Mom, she said quietly, I don't think we've just lost a husband and a father. What do you mean? I think we might be racing against time to save him. The old flip phone sat on the kitchen counter, its tiny screen glowing faintly in the dim morning light, as though it were watching us the way we kept watching it. Neither of us spoke for a long while. The message still stared back at us from the screen. Your family will pay next. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling suddenly cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. I don't understand how your father could keep something like this from us. 28 years, Emma. 28 years. And I never once suspected he was carrying a weight like this. Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the photograph from the brown file again, studying the man with the black X across his face, the confident smile, the arm draped casually over Richard's shoulder as though they had been close friends once, brothers in some shared ambition. Who was he? She murmured. And why did Dad mark his face like that? By mid-morning, Emma had turned the dining room into a temporary office, her laptop open, old newspaper clippings and business articles, and printed records covering every inch of the table. She searched every combination she could think of, cross-referencing names, dates, company registrations, anything that might connect the dots between the photograph and the danger now sitting at our doorstep. I made more coffee neither of us drank, simply because my hands needed something to do besides shake. It was mid-afternoon when the old flip phone finally vibrated, buzzing against the counter with a sound so unexpected that both Emma and I jumped, my coffee mug nearly slipping from my hands. The screen displayed only one word, unknown. Emma answered, her voice steadier than I expected. Hello? For a moment silence. Then Richard's voice, soft, tired, threadbare in a way I had never heard from him before. Did anyone follow you? Emma's heart raced. I could see it in the way her free hand gripped the edge of the table. No. Listen carefully. Dad, where are you? I can't tell you. Why not? Because if you know, you could be forced to tell someone. Emma glanced nervously toward the window, half expecting the dark sedan to have returned. Dad, who is Michael Lane? The silence that followed felt endless, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped entirely. Finally, Richard whispered, So you found his name. You knew we would. I hoped you wouldn't. Dad! Another pause, heavier than the last. Then he spoke the sentence Emma would remember for the rest of her life, the sentence she would repeat to me later with a kind of haunted disbelief. Michael Lane wasn't the most dangerous man I ever met. Emma's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Richard inhaled sharply, and I could hear the tremor in it even through the phone's tinny speaker. He worked for someone else. Before Emma could ask another question, the call ended. No goodbye, no explanation, only silence. She lowered the phone with trembling hands, staring at it, as though it might ring again if she simply willed it hard enough. I searched my daughter's face. What did he say? Emma looked toward the photograph lying on the table, the black X still dark and accusing against the stranger's face. Her voice was barely a whisper. I don't think Michael Lane is the villain. She swallowed hard. I think he's only the beginning. Outside, across the street, a dark SUV rolled slowly past the house. It didn't stop, but whoever sat behind the tinted windows seemed to linger a beat too long, seemed to be watching, and by the time it disappeared around the corner, both of us had gone completely still, holding our breath as though the house itself might give us away. We spent the rest of that afternoon combing through everything we could find on Michael Lane, and slowly, a fuller picture began to take shape. Lane had co-founded the investment firm with Richard, and two silent partners whose names appeared nowhere in the public record, hidden behind layers of shell companies and holding entities that Emma, with her old legal training, recognized as deliberately designed to obscure who truly controlled the money. This wasn't an accident, Emma said quietly, staring at a diagram she'd sketched out on the legal pad, arrows connecting company names to account numbers, to dates that stretched back more than a decade. Someone built this to hide behind. Michael Lane took the fall publicly, but whoever set this up made sure their own name never appeared anywhere. And Richard knew, I said, the realization settling over me like a stone. Richard knew who that person was. And I think, Emma said slowly, that person has known, this whole time, that Dad knew. That evening, as the sun began to set and long shadows stretched across our quiet street, I found myself standing in the doorway of Richard's office again, looking at the desk where he'd sat every evening for years, answering emails long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. I thought of all the nights I had assumed he was simply tired from work, all the years I had never once asked him to explain the shadows beneath his eyes. I thought of the fear on his face when he told me he wanted a divorce, and for the first time, I understood it wasn't the fear of a man caught in an affair, or a man simply tired of his marriage. It was the fear of a man who believed, with everything in him, that loving us from a distance was the only way left to keep us safe. The black SUV disappeared around the corner, but neither Emma nor I could shake the feeling that someone had been watching the house, that our ordinary street had become a stage for something neither of us fully understood. Emma quietly locked the front door, checking it twice, then a third time. For the first time in 28 years, I pulled every curtain closed before noon, moving from room to room with a strange, hollow urgency, as though drawing fabric across glass could somehow keep danger from finding its way in. The familiar home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt exposed, its windows suddenly like 100 watching eyes. Emma placed the old flip phone on the kitchen table, staring at it as though it might reveal something new, if she looked long enough. Dad called twice, she said thoughtfully. He never asked how we were. I frowned. You're right. He only wanted to know if anyone had followed us. She looked down at the handwritten note Richard had sent with the phone. Trust no one until then. She read it again, turning it over in her hands out of habit more than purpose. Then something caught her attention. On the back of the note, barely visible under the kitchen light, was a series of numbers, faint, as though written in a hurry. 1147, CCB, 22. Mom. I leaned closer, squinting at the faint pencil marks. I've never noticed that. Emma held the paper near the window, tilting it until the light caught the indentations properly. It's not random. What do you think it means? I suddenly froze, a memory surfacing from somewhere deep and half forgotten. Oh my goodness. What? CCB. I pressed a hand to my mouth. Emma, your father banked with Community Commerce Bank for years. Before we switched everything over to the credit union, that's where he kept his personal accounts. The bank downtown? I nodded slowly, memory tugging at memory now, the way one loose thread unravels an entire sweater. He rented a safety deposit box there, after your grandfather passed away. He said it was for important documents, the deed, some old family papers. He handled it himself. I never asked to see inside. Emma stared at me. You never told me. I forgot about it, I admitted, feeling a flush of shame creep up my neck. It felt like such a small thing at the time, just paperwork. The two of us exchanged a nervous glance, the same unspoken question passing between us. Could Richard have left something there? Something meant only for the day when everything else had already gone wrong? By early afternoon, we stood inside the quiet marble lobby of Community Commerce Bank, the air conditioning humming softly overhead as customers came and went, oblivious to the storm the two of us carried in with us. A polite bank manager, a young man with kind eyes, and a name tag reading Derek, greeted us at the counter. "How may I help you?" Emma explained, her voice carefully composed despite everything churning beneath the surface, that her father maintained a safety deposit box under the account number we'd found on the back of Richard's note. The manager checked the records, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I'm sorry," he said, "but only the authorized account holder may access it." My shoulders sank. "So there's nothing we can do?" The manager hesitated, studying the screen a moment longer than seemed necessary. "Unless," he scrolled further down, his brow furrowing slightly. "There are written instructions to release the contents to Mrs. Evelyn Carter if Mr. Carter failed to appear before today's closing time." Emma's heart skipped. Today's closing time? The manager nodded. Those instructions were filed nearly 6 months ago. 6 months. The words settled over me like a weight. Richard had planned for this 6 months ago, had sat in this very bank and made arrangements for a day he must have believed, even then, might come. A day when he would be gone, and I would need something only he could leave behind. The manager disappeared into a secure room at the back of the bank. Minutes later, he returned carrying a small sealed envelope, handling it with the same careful respect a person might show a piece of family history. "This is all that was left for you," he said gently. I accepted it with trembling hands, thanking him in a voice that barely worked, and Emma and I hurried back to the car before either of us could open it in front of strangers. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a silver key, small and unmarked, a folded street map with one location circled in red ink, and a handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter first, Richard's familiar handwriting filling the page in careful, deliberate strokes, as though he had rewritten it several times to make sure every word was exactly right. "My dearest Evelyn, if you're holding this letter, then I've run out of time to explain things the way I wanted. Everything I've done, even asking for the divorce, was to keep you and Emma out of danger. Please don't blame yourselves. And whatever you do, don't go to the place marked on the map alone." Emma's eyes filled with tears, spilling over before she could stop them. He knew we'd find this. I kept reading, my voice unsteady. "There is one person you can trust completely. His name is Thomas Bennett. He owes me a debt that can never be repaid. Show him the silver key. He'll know what it means." Emma looked up. "Who's Thomas Bennett?" I shook my head slowly. I've never heard that name in my life. The letter ended with one final sentence, one that would stay with me long after that afternoon or sunset. We looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. Both of us understood. Whatever Richard had been trying to protect us from, the answers were no longer inside our house, no longer hidden in locked drawers or old bank vaults. They were waiting at the cabin, 2 hours away, at the end of a road neither of us had ever traveled. We debated it for nearly an hour, before finally deciding, the two of us sitting in the car outside the bank, the engine idling while the afternoon light began its slow slide toward evening. "He said not to go alone," Emma reminded me, though her hand was already reaching for the ignition. "But he also said the truth is waiting there. Mom, I can't just sit at home wondering. I can't." Neither could I. Whatever fear lived in that warning, it was smaller than the fear of never understanding why the man I loved had walked out our front door 2 nights earlier, with tears in his eyes and a stranger's threat sitting somewhere in his past. We arranged for Lily to stay with Emma's husband, offering only a vague explanation about needing to run some errands together, and by the time we pulled onto the highway, the sun had already begun its long orange descent toward the horizon. The drive took us out of the city and into a stretch of countryside neither of us had visited before, the road narrowing from 4 lanes to 2, then finally to a single cracked strip of pavement bordered by tall pines that blotted out what remained of the daylight. Emma drove with both hands tight on the wheel, glancing constantly into the rearview mirror. It was somewhere around the halfway point that she first noticed it, a dark SUV, the same model we'd seen parked outside our house, trailing perhaps a quarter-mile behind us, keeping pace no matter how Emma adjusted her speed. "Mom," she said quietly, Don't look back, but I think we're being followed. My heart slammed against my ribs. Are you sure? I've seen that same SUV 3 times in the last 20 minutes. We didn't have a plan, only instinct. And Emma's instinct told her to take the next unmarked turn, a narrow gravel road that curved sharply into the trees. She cut her headlights the moment we were fully hidden by the tree line, easing the car to a slow stop in a small clearing while both of us held our breath, watching the road behind us through the back windshield. The SUV passed. It didn't slow. Whether the driver hadn't noticed our turn or simply hadn't cared, neither of us could say, but after several long minutes of silence, Emma exhaled and eased the car back onto the gravel road, taking a longer, winding route the rest of the way that added nearly half an hour to our drive. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was low and orange, casting long shadows across an overgrown yard that looked as though no one had tended it in years. The cabin itself sat back from the shoreline of a small, still lake, its wood siding weathered gray, its porch swing hanging crooked from a single remaining chain. The grass had grown wild around the foundation, and the paint on the shutters had peeled away in long, curling strips. "Are you sure this is the place?" I asked, though the red circle on the map left little room for doubt. Emma checked the map once more against the fading landmarks around us, and nodded. We approached the front door cautiously, our footsteps loud against the silence of the woods. The door was unlocked, swinging open at the lightest push with a groan of old hinges that seemed to announce our arrival to anyone who might be listening. Inside, dust covered nearly everything: the furniture, the counters, a stack of old newspapers on a side table. But one room, a small study just off the main living area, looked recently used. A single mug sat on the desk, coffee still faintly warm to the touch when Emma pressed her fingers against the ceramic. "Someone's been here," she whispered. "Recently." We searched the room carefully, opening drawers, checking behind picture frames, running our hands along the walls for anything hidden. It was Emma who found it, a slight unevenness beneath an old, faded rug near the fireplace. She knelt and pulled the rug aside, revealing a section of floorboard that didn't quite match the rest, a small brass ring set flush into the wood. She pulled, and the floorboard lifted away to reveal a hidden compartment beneath, just large enough to hold a small metal case. My hands shook as Emma lifted it free and set it on the desk. The case was locked, a simple keyhole set into its center. "The silver key," I said. Emma pulled it from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she fitted into the lock. It turned smoothly, as though it had been waiting exactly for this moment. Inside the case were 3 things: a flash drive, small and unmarked, a family photograph, the 4 of us, taken years earlier at a lake house we'd rented one summer, all of us sunburned and laughing, with a handwritten apology scrawled across the back in Richard's hand, and a notebook, its pages filled with dates, names, and a long column of unexplained payments stretching back more than a decade. I picked up the photograph first, running my thumb across Richard's apology, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears. "He's been carrying this alone for years," I whispered. "All this time, and I never knew." Emma's own eyes glistened as she looked at the photograph over my shoulder. "Mom, I wish he'd trusted us enough to let us carry it with him." I nodded, unable to speak, the weight of 28 years of quiet devotion suddenly rearranging itself into something both more beautiful and more heartbreaking than I had understood before. It was then, just as Emma reached for the flash drive, that we heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Both of us froze. A shadow passed the front window, tall and unfamiliar, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had no reason to hide. Someone tried the doorknob. Emma's hand found mine in the dim light of the study, gripping tight. "Emma," I whispered, "we're not alone." Emma's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the footsteps outside the cabin, or so she told me later, though at the time all either of us could hear was our own ragged breathing and the low creak of old wood settling beneath unfamiliar weight. She gripped the metal case with one hand and instinctively reached for me with the other. "Evelyn, someone's here," she whispered, though of course she meant to say Mom, and the slip only told me how frightened she truly was. The old wooden floor creaked beneath the footsteps outside. Another step, then another. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to hide. The doorknob turned slowly. Emma held her breath. I held mine. Somewhere in the back of my mind, absurdly, I thought of Lily, safe at home with her father, and I prayed with everything in me that whatever happened in this cabin would happen far away from her. But instead of opening, the footsteps moved away. Silence. For nearly a full minute, neither of us dared move. Finally, I exhaled, the breath shaking on its way out. I think they're gone. Emma wasn't convinced. She walked carefully to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. Beyond it, the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, the lake beyond them turning the color of dark honey in the last of the light. No SUV, no strangers, nothing. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. Someone had been there. She was sure of it, and so was I. "Let's see what's on the flash drive," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Emma nodded. We searched the cabin until we found an old laptop tucked inside a cabinet in the corner of the study, its case scuffed and its battery nearly dead. It took several anxious minutes plugged into an outlet before it powered on at all, the screen flickering weakly to life. Emma inserted the flash drive. A single folder appeared. Its name was simple: For My Family. Inside were dozens of files. Scanned contracts, their margins covered in Richard's handwritten notes. Financial records, columns of numbers that meant little to me but made Emma's breath catch more than once. Photographs, some of them decades old, showing Richard younger, standing beside men I didn't recognize in the lobbies of buildings I'd never seen. Voice recordings, their file names simply dates, and one video. The video was dated just 3 days before Richard had asked for the divorce. Emma clicked play. Richard appeared on the screen, sitting in what looked like this very study, the same desk visible behind him. He looked exhausted, his hair unkempt, dark circles surrounding his eyes in a way I hadn't fully registered until I saw it reflected back at me on a laptop screen. He forced a faint smile, the kind that broke my heart more than any tears could have. "If you're watching this," he paused, swallowing hard. "Then things have gone very wrong." I covered my mouth with my hand, tears already spilling freely. Richard looked directly into the camera, as though he could see through it, through the months and the miles, straight into the kitchen, where I would one day watch this recording. "Evelyn, Emma, Daniel, I am so sorry. I never wanted any of you to carry this burden. I believed I could fix it myself." He lowered his eyes, and for a moment the recording seemed to catch its breath along with him. "I was wrong." Emma felt tears forming, her hand tightening around mine. Richard continued, his voice steadier now, as though he had rehearsed this part many times. 12 years ago, I trusted the wrong people. I thought we were building something that would help struggling families invest safely. Ordinary people, Evelyn, teachers, nurses, people like your own mother, saving what little they could for retirement. But one of my partners had different plans. He stole millions. He disappeared. "And he left the rest of us to deal with the consequences," Emma whispered, almost without meaning to. "Michael Lane." Richard nodded on the screen, almost as if he had heard her from across the months, separating the recording from this moment. Most people blamed Michael, but Michael wasn't the one pulling the strings. There was another man, a man whose name appears nowhere in the newspapers, nowhere in the court records, nowhere at all, because he made certain of it. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering. Richard reached for a document lying beside him on the desk, holding it up briefly toward the camera before setting it back down. "If anything happens to me, you'll find his name in the red ledger." Emma frowned. "The red ledger?" Richard continued, his voice dropping lower. "I hid it somewhere only your mother would think to look." I searched my memory frantically. "What does that mean? Richard, what does that mean?" The video suddenly glitched, the image freezing for a moment, static filling the screen before the recording resumed. When it did, Richard looked frightened now, glancing over his shoulder, as though someone had entered the room behind him. "They've found me." He stood abruptly, the camera catching only a blur of motion. "If I don't survive this, I need you to remember one thing. No amount of money is worth losing your family." The screen went black. The video had ended. Neither of us spoke. Tears streamed freely down my face now, and for the first time since Richard had left, I understood. He hadn't abandoned us. He had been trying, in the only way he believed possible, to save us. Emma closed the laptop gently, as though it were something fragile that deserved tenderness after what it had just shown us. We have to find the red ledger. I nodded. But where? He said only I would know where to look. Just then, a loud engine roared outside the cabin, cutting through the quiet evening like a blade. Emma rushed to the window. The dark SUV had returned. This time, it wasn't alone. 2 more vehicles pulled in behind it, headlights cutting harsh white beams across the overgrown yard, and together, the 3 vehicles blocked the only road leading away from the cabin. Someone stepped out of the lead vehicle, his silhouette tall and unhurried against the glare of his own headlights. Even from a distance, Emma could tell he wasn't there by accident. He looked directly at the cabin. Then he smiled, a slow, confident smile that made my blood run cold, and started walking toward the front door. There was no time to think, only to act. Emma grabbed the metal case and shoved the flash drive deep into her jacket pocket, while I snatched the family photograph and the notebook from the desk, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Outside, gravel crunched beneath slow, deliberate footsteps, drawing closer with every second. "Back door," Emma whispered, already moving. "There has to be a back door." There was, tucked behind the kitchen, half hidden by a stack of old firewood someone had left leaning against the frame years ago. Emma shoved it open, wincing at the loud creak of unused hinges, and we slipped out into the cool evening air, the lake stretching dark and still just beyond the tree line. We didn't run toward the car. We couldn't. The men blocking the road had positioned their vehicles exactly where we needed to go. Instead, Emma pulled me toward the tree line along the water's edge, her grip on my arm firm and certain in a way that reminded me, absurdly, of when she was small and I had been the one pulling her along instead. Behind us, we heard the front door of the cabin creak open, heard a man's voice call out, calm and unhurried, almost amused. "Mrs. Carter, there's no need to run. We only want to talk." Neither of us believed him. We kept moving, weaving through the trees along the shoreline, the lake's dark water lapping gently against half-submerged roots and stones. My lungs burned. My heels, entirely wrong for running through underbrush, caught on roots and fallen branches, and twice I nearly went down before Emma's hand caught my elbow and steadied me. We had gone perhaps a quarter mile when headlights swept across the trees ahead of us. Another vehicle, approaching from the narrow access road that curved around the far side of the lake. Emma pulled me down behind a fallen log, both of us pressing ourselves flat against the cold earth, hearts hammering in unison. The vehicle slowed, a door opened, footsteps approached, unhurried, deliberate. "Evelyn Carter," a voice said, gentler than I expected, older, worn at the edges the way a voice gets after years of carrying something heavy. "Emma, my name is Thomas Bennett. Richard sent me." Emma's grip on my arm tightened, and for a moment neither of us moved, unsure whether this was rescue or another trap dressed in kinder words. "Show me the silver key," the voice said. "Richard told me you'd have it, if you found the letter." Slowly, cautiously, Emma rose from behind the log, the key still clutched in her palm from earlier. She held it out into the beam of a small flashlight the stranger carried, and I watched his face, lined, weathered, perhaps 60 years old, with kind eyes that seemed to carry their own history of regret. He exhaled, something like relief passing over his features. "Thank God. Get in the car, quickly, before the others realize you've slipped past them." We didn't have the luxury of deliberation. Emma and I climbed into the back seat of Thomas Bennett's sedan, and he pulled away from the lake road with practiced calm, cutting his headlights as he navigated a route that clearly wasn't new to him. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, once my breathing had steadied enough to speak. "I worked with your husband a long time ago," Thomas said, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. "Before Michael Lane, before any of this, Richard and I started together, 2 young men who believed we could build something good." "And the man behind Michael Lane," Emma said, "the one from the video, do you know who he is?" Thomas Bennett's jaw tightened, his hands flexing against the steering wheel. "His name is Gerald Whitfield. 12 years ago, he was a silent investor in our firm, The kind of man who never appeared on paperwork, never sat in meetings, never let his name touch anything that could be traced. He used Michael Lane as a face for the operation, while he pulled the money through a dozen shell accounts. When Richard discovered what was happening, he tried to stop it. He gathered evidence. He planned to go to the authorities. "What happened?" I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. Whitfield found out before Richard could act. He made it very clear what would happen to Richard's family if he went forward. Richard buried the evidence instead, believing silence was the price of keeping you and your children safe. He's paid that price every day since, Evelyn, every single day. Tears blurred my vision again, though these were different from the tears I'd cried 2 nights earlier at our dining table. These were tears for a man who had sacrificed his own peace, his own reputation, his own happiness, to shield the people he loved from a danger none of us had known existed. "Where is he now?" Emma asked. "Is he safe?" Thomas Bennett's expression darkened. "Whitfield's people took him 3 hours ago, not far from his hotel. That's why I came to find you. Richard managed to get word to me before they took his phone. He believed you'd come to the cabin. He was right to believe it, but it also means you're both in danger now too." My stomach dropped. "They have Richard. They believe he still has something Whitfield wants desperately. The red ledger, the one document that would finally connect Whitfield directly to everything that happened 12 years ago. Every account, every stolen dollar, every family that lost everything. If that ledger surfaces, Whitfield goes to prison for the rest of his life." "Then we need to find it," Emma said, her voice hardening with the same resolve I'd seen in her since the night the divorce papers first appeared on our table. "And we need to find Dad." Thomas Bennett glanced at us in the rearview mirror, something like hope flickering behind his tired eyes for the first time since he'd pulled us into the car. "Richard's letter said only you would know where to look, Evelyn. Think, is there anywhere, any place in your life together that would mean something only to the two of you? Somewhere he'd trust you to remember, and no one else would think to search?" I closed my eyes, letting 28 years of memory wash over me. Every anniversary, every quiet Thursday evening, every small ritual that had built our marriage one ordinary day at a time. And then, quite suddenly, I knew. "The Coastal Inn," I whispered, "where we spent our honeymoon. I was planning to surprise him with a trip there for our anniversary. He knew. He must have known I'd already booked the room." Emma turned to me, eyes wide. "Are you sure?" "He always kept important things close to what mattered most," I said, the certainty settling over me like something solid and unshakable for the first time in 3 days. "He wouldn't hide it somewhere strategic or clever. He'd hide it somewhere that meant everything to us." Thomas Bennett's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he turned the car onto the highway leading toward the coast, the darkness of the night pressing in around us on all sides. "Then that's where we're going," he said, "and we need to get there before Whitfield's people think of it too." The drive to the coast took nearly 3 hours. 3 hours, during which Thomas Bennett told us everything he knew, filling in the gaps of a story that had been quietly unraveling my husband's peace of mind for over a decade. 12 years earlier, Richard, Thomas, and Michael Lane had built their investment firm together with genuine ambition, a company meant to help working families, teachers and nurses, and small business owners grow modest savings into something that could carry them through retirement. Gerald Whitfield had approached them in the second year, offering capital in exchange for a silent partnership. No public involvement, no name on any documents. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary business arrangement, the kind that happens quietly in finance every day. But Whitfield had used that silence as cover, funneling client funds through a web of shell companies Michael Lane had unknowingly helped establish, believing he was simply following standard diversification strategy. By the time Richard discovered the fraud, tracing irregular transfers back to accounts that led, eventually, to Whitfield himself, millions of dollars belonging to ordinary families had already vanished. "Richard came to me first," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on the dark highway ahead. "He wanted to go to the authorities immediately. I told him we needed proof, real proof, something undeniable. So he built the red ledger, every transaction, every shell account, every dollar traced back to its true destination. It took him nearly 8 months, working in secret, terrified the entire time that Whitfield would discover what he was doing." "And Whitfield found out?" I said quietly. Thomas nodded. Someone tipped him off. To this day, Richard doesn't know who. Whitfield came to him personally, late one night, and made himself very clear. He knew where Emma went to school. He knew where Daniel played baseball. He knew your morning routine, Evelyn, down to which coffee shop you visited on Tuesdays. He wanted Richard to understand that his family's safety depended entirely on his silence. Emma's hand found mine in the darkness of the back seat, gripping tight. Richard buried the ledger, Thomas continued. He let Michael Lane take the public fall, though Michael, to his credit, never revealed Richard's name either, believing until his own disappearance that protecting his old partner was the only decent thing left to do. Whitfield walked away untouched, his name nowhere in any court document, any newspaper article, any public record. And Richard has spent 12 years watching him grow, more powerful, more wealthy, more untouchable, all while carrying the guilt of every family who lost everything because he chose silence over justice. Why now? I asked. Why did all of this come to a head now, after 12 years of quiet? Thomas's jaw tightened. 3 months ago, Whitfield's operation attracted attention from federal regulators, an unrelated investigation that happened to brush up against one of his old shell accounts. He panicked. He believed Richard might finally come forward, might use the ledger to save himself by exposing Whitfield first. So he began making threats again, worse than before. That's when Richard decided the only way to protect you both was to disappear from your lives entirely, to make himself an easy target so that Whitfield would leave you and Emma alone. He thought divorcing me would protect us, I whispered, the words settling into place with a terrible, aching clarity. He thought if we were no longer connected to him in the eyes of the world, Whitfield would have no reason to hurt us. That's exactly what he thought, Thomas said quietly. And he was wrong, Evelyn. Whitfield doesn't care about legal paperwork. He cares about eliminating anyone who might expose him. Divorce or not, you were never truly safe until that ledger surfaces, and Whitfield is finally held accountable. We arrived at the coastal town well after midnight, the gray-shingled inn standing quiet and dark against a backdrop of restless ocean waves. The same building where Richard and I had spent our honeymoon 28 years earlier. The same pier stretching out into black water where he had once promised we would grow old together. Thomas parked a block away, insisting we approach on foot to avoid drawing attention. The night air smelled of salt and cold sand, and my heart pounded with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt almost like coming home. The inn's night manager, an elderly woman who had clearly worked there for decades, recognized my name the moment I gave it. Mrs. Carter, she said warmly, though confusion flickered across her face at the late hour and the urgency in my voice. Your husband checked in 3 days ago. He asked us to hold a package for you, should you arrive asking for it. My breath caught. A package? She retrieved a small, weathered box from behind the front desk, sliding it across the counter with the same careful reverence the bank manager had shown the envelope earlier that day. Inside, wrapped in an old scarf I recognized as one I'd left at the inn decades earlier, believing it lost forever, was a slim red ledger, its pages filled with Richard's meticulous handwriting, dates, account numbers, and names stretching back 12 years. At the very front of the ledger, tucked into the binding, was a short note. Evelyn, if you're reading this, you found your way back to where we started. I always knew you would. Tears streamed down my face as Emma wrapped her arms around me, both of us holding the ledger between us, as though it were something alive, something that could finally set us free from 12 years of silence neither of us had known we were carrying. Now we need to get this to the authorities, Thomas said, his voice urgent. And we need to find Richard before Whitfield realizes what we've done. We drove through the remainder of the night, Thomas Bennett navigating back roads he seemed to know from some earlier chapter of his life he never fully explained, while Emma sat in the back seat with the red ledger open across her lap, photographing every page with her phone in case anything happened to the original, before we reached safety. It was nearly dawn when Thomas finally pulled into a quiet federal building on the outskirts of the city, one he explained belonged to an old contact of his, a former colleague who now worked in financial crimes enforcement, and who Thomas trusted with something that had taken 12 years to surface. The agent who met us, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, with tired eyes and an immediate, no-nonsense competence, listened to our story without interruption, examining the ledger page by page, while Emma explained everything we'd pieced together over 3 sleepless days. "This is enough," Agent Alvarez said finally, closing the ledger with something like quiet triumph in her voice. "This connects Whitfield directly to every fraudulent transfer, every shell account, everything. We've suspected his involvement for years, but never had proof strong enough to move forward. This changes everything." "What about Richard?" I asked, my voice breaking. "They took him. Please, we need to find him." Agent Alvarez was already reaching for her phone, dialing a number with practiced urgency. "We'll move immediately. If Whitfield's people are holding him somewhere, this ledger gives us the leverage to act fast, before he has time to disappear." The next several hours passed in a blur of coordinated chaos. Federal agents moving through properties connected to Whitfield's network. Agent Alvarez working the phones with a focus that gave me something to hold on to besides my own terror. Emma and I waited in a small conference room, clutching cups of coffee neither of us drank, watching the clock crawl forward one unbearable minute at a time. It was nearly noon when Agent Alvarez finally returned, her expression unreadable for a long, terrifying moment before it broke into something like relief. "We found him," she said. "He's alive. He's safe. They're bringing him in now." I don't remember standing. I don't remember crossing the room. I only remember, sometime later, the doors opening and Richard stepping through them, disheveled, exhausted, a bruise darkening along his jaw, but alive, unmistakably alive, his eyes finding mine across the room with an expression I had seen only once before, on the day he'd promised to love me for the rest of his life. I crossed the distance between us, and he caught me, both of us holding on, as though letting go might undo everything. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into my hair, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I only ever wanted to keep you safe." "You should have trusted me," I said, though there was no anger left in me, only relief so overwhelming it left no room for anything else. 28 years, Richard. I would have carried this with you." "I know that now," he said. "I was a fool to think I could carry it alone. I was a fool to think leaving would protect you, when all it did was break both our hearts." Emma joined us then, wrapping her arms around us both, and for a long moment the 3 of us simply stood there in the middle of that sterile federal building, holding each other the way we should have been holding each other for 12 long years. In the weeks that followed, Gerald Whitfield's carefully constructed empire collapsed, with the same speed and thoroughness he had once used to hide it. The Red Ledger, combined with Richard's testimony and the evidence Thomas Bennett had quietly preserved over the years, gave federal prosecutors everything they needed. Whitfield was arrested within days, charged with fraud, extortion, and conspiracy spanning more than a decade. Dozens of families who had lost their savings 12 years earlier finally received some measure of justice, and though it could never fully restore what they'd lost, it gave them something they'd been denied for far too long: the truth. Michael Lane, it turned out, had been living quietly under a different name in a small town 2 states away, having spent 12 years believing he alone bore the blame for what happened. When investigators finally located him, he wept upon learning that Richard had never blamed him, had in fact spent over a decade protecting the truth that would eventually clear both their names. Richard withdrew the divorce papers the same week Whitfield was arrested, tearing them apart with his own hands in our kitchen, the same kitchen where he had once placed them so carefully between us like a wall neither of us understood. "I never wanted this," he told me that evening, holding the torn pieces in his open palms as though they were something he needed to physically release. "I only ever wanted to keep you and the children safe. I know now that safety was never something I could buy with silence or distance. It was something we could only find together." Our 29th anniversary arrived 3 weeks later, and we spent it exactly where I had originally planned, at the gray-shingled inn by the sea, walking the same stretch of beach where he had once promised we would grow old together. The ocean was cold that day, the wind sharp enough to make Emma's scarf, the one we'd found wrapped around the Red Ledger, whip around my shoulders as Richard and I walked slowly along the shoreline, hand in hand, the way we had 28 years earlier, as 2 young people who believed love could survive anything. "I used to think the hardest thing in our marriage would be the ordinary struggles," I told him as the tide rolled in around our bare feet. "Money, raising children, growing older." Richard squeezed my hand, the same hand that had trembled so badly the night he'd told me he wanted a divorce. And instead, the hardest thing turned out to be a secret I never should have carried alone. "What did you learn from all of it?" I asked, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the water. He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words the way he always did, carefully, deliberately, a man who valued precision, even in matters of the heart. "I learned that protecting the people you love doesn't mean carrying every burden by yourself. Sometimes it means trusting them enough to carry it with you. I spent 12 years believing silence was an act of love. It wasn't. It was fear, wearing love's clothing. Real love would have trusted you from the very beginning." I thought of everything we had survived together in 28 years. The arguments over money, the fear during Emma's surgery, the grief of burying his parents, and now this, a danger neither of us could have imagined, hiding beneath the surface of our ordinary Thursday evenings for over a decade. And I understood, standing there with the cold Atlantic wind in my hair and my husband's hand in mine, that our marriage had never been broken at all. It had simply been carrying more weight than either of us knew, waiting for the day it would finally be shared instead of hidden. Daniel flew in from Chicago the following weekend, and for the first time in months, our entire family gathered around the same dining table where Richard had once placed those divorce papers between us, like an unbridgeable distance. Now the table held something else entirely: Lily's crayon drawings, Emma's lasagna, Daniel's easy laughter, and at the head of the table, Richard, no longer carrying the weight of a secret 12 years in the making, finally free to simply be a husband, a father, a grandfather, present in every ordinary moment the way he had always wanted to be. "To second chances," Emma said, raising her glass that evening, her eyes finding mine across the table, with a warmth that told me she understood, perhaps better than anyone, how close we had come to losing everything, and how much sweeter it felt to have found our way back. "To trust," Richard added, raising his own glass toward me, his eyes glistening in the warm kitchen light. "The kind that doesn't need to hide anything, not even the hardest truths." I raised my glass last, looking around at the family I had nearly lost, without ever understanding why. At the husband who had tried to protect us in the only broken way he knew how. At the daughter whose fierce determination had unraveled 12 years of silence in a matter of days. At the granddaughter who would grow up never knowing how close her family had come to shattering entirely. "To 28 years," I said, my voice steady despite the tears gathering in my eyes. "And to every year still ahead of us, lived honestly together, no matter what it costs." Outside, the September evening settled gently over our quiet street, the roses in the garden finally receiving the attention they'd been missing, Richard having spent the entire afternoon kneeling in the dirt, restoring what had been neglected during the darkest days of that terrible week. The porch light glowed warm against the coming dusk, and inside, our family's laughter filled a house that had nearly gone silent forever. Some marriages break under the weight of ordinary problems: money, distance, the slow erosion of shared dreams. Ours had nearly broken under something far larger, a threat neither of us had chosen, hidden beneath 12 years of misplaced love, disguised as protection. But in the end, it wasn't the danger that saved us. It was the truth, finally spoken aloud after too many years of silence, and the stubborn, unshakable love of a daughter who refused to accept an explanation that didn't ring true. 28 years had taught me that love isn't only tested in the easy seasons, the Thursday evenings and predictable routines we had grown so comfortable within. It is tested in the seasons no one prepares you for, the ones that arrive without warning and demand everything you have. Richard and I had faced ours, and though it had nearly cost us everything, we had come through it together, finally, completely, with nothing left hidden between us. And as I stood in my kitchen that evening, watching my husband laugh with our grandchild, our daughter, our son home from Chicago, I understood that the truest kind of safety was never found in silence or distance or protective lies. It was found here, in this kitchen, in this family, in 28 years of love that had finally learned to hold nothing back. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Talesbyallstories for more unforgettable family dramas. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done in her place? I'll see you in the next story.